For those of you who have just joined, welcome to panel 2 on China, capital, and the SDGs. Before I introduce the panel, allow me to run a quick Zoom poll just to capture any thoughts on this topic that you may have. So, for those who have just tuned in, don't know me, my name is Michael Yip. I'm the co-head of the Young China Watchers branch in London. And as far as today is concerned, you've tuned into a panel that has as its mission today an examination of the following question: financing a sustainable Belt and Road, what is the state of play? And that's because in the same way it's true that this decade, the 2020s, is the decisive decade for tackling climate change, the same is also true for achieving by 2030 the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, intended, and I quote, as a blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and planet now and into the future, end quote. And through the Belt and Road Initiative over the past few years, we've seen that China's capital deployment has also sought to play its own part in advancing the SDGs and sustainable development more generally. I think, for instance, we've seen increasing analysis and strategic intention on the part of financiers in relation to sustainability-linked finance transactions, and and also in relation to upholding environmental and social safeguards. Meanwhile, on the government side, we've seen the Chinese Finance Ministry sign MOUs with 6 multilateral development banks to collaborate on aligning BRI finance with the SDGs. And at the UN, we've seen at headquarters, they've developed policy recommendations for 14 BRI countries to enhance the sustainability outcomes from BRI projects. So all of these developments are really promising. My question today is, what more can we do that can be done to align the BRI with the SDGs, and how? Where is the alignment strong? Where is it not so strong? And to help shed some light on these questions, I've called upon a group of leading experts in this field to share their thoughts. And they are Eugenia Gusilov, who joins us from Romania today. She's the founding director of the Romania Energy Center. Concurrently, she also consults for international organizations, and the most recent assignment being the UN Department for Economic and Social Affairs on aligning the SDGs and the Belt and Road. Her current areas of interest include energy markets, policies and regulation, oil and gas, heat and generation, energy transition, and energy economics. Welcome, Eugenia.
Thank you, Michael, and hello to everyone.
Thanks. A huge welcome also goes out to Sarah Tang, who joins us from China today. She's a green finance researcher at the Green Belt and Road Initiative Center, that's part of the International Institute of Green Finance, based in Beijing. She tracks the latest development of Chinese overseas investment policies and strategies in BRI countries. Previously, Sarah worked on insurance and the banking sector's climate risk assessment projects at the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative in Switzerland, as well as at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation in Canada. Hi, Sarah.
Thanks for the introduction, Michael. Very happy to be here.
You're very, very welcome. And finally, we have Rastraraj Bhandari, who joins us from Abu Dhabi today. He is a climate finance and policy specialist. He's also the founding member of the Geopolitics and Ecology of Himalayan Water Initiative at the New York University in Abu Dhabi. He's also a contributing writer for the Nepali Times, and previously he's consulted for a number of international organizations, including the World Bank and the UN. And his most recent assignment is at the Asian Development Bank, where he works on carbon pricing and low carbon development initiatives. Thanks for joining us, Rastraraj. All speak to us in their personal capacity today. And as before, this panel is run as webinar style format. So please send your questions and messages into the chat box, and I'll pick them up as we go through the call today. In terms of the proceedings, we'll split half between the 4 of us as a moderated conversation, and the remaining half for any questions you may have. So without any further ado, my question is for Eugenia, and it's a question about, it's a question I think that helps us solidify our understanding of the basic building blocks of our conversation today. When I think about the BRI and the SDGs, I see them as 2 separate concepts promoted by 2 different actors with different purposes. One is about connectivity, first and foremost, the other on sustainability, but that's an oversimplification. My question is, to what extent do both actually complement each other?
Well, thank you for the question. You're absolutely right in the sense that these are 2 different concepts. So they were born in different contexts. They were designed and thought in different circumstances with different things in mind. So from the very beginning, the complementarity was not a given. But then, doesn't mean that there are no synergies between the two. And this is what the project that I have worked on in the previous 2 years has been about, like finding potential synergies between the UN 2030 agenda, so the SDGs, and the Belt and Road Initiative. So yes, the first one was launched with the connectivity in mind. The second, so the SDGs is about sustainability. But that doesn't mean they cannot and should not go hand in hand, because if there are points of intersection in which one can enhance the other, I think everyone would have something to gain from this, because first of all, it could, I mean, it has the potential to maximize the benefits to society, to economy. What does this mean? This means that even if they were not designed with complementarity in mind from the very beginning, it doesn't mean that complementarity cannot be found along the way, or how should I say this? Adjustments cannot be made along the way, especially to the, let's say, the Belt and the Road Initiative framework, which can enhance what the UN is doing with the 2030 agenda, right? So these complementarity points can make the potential benefits be long-term, and make them more sustainable instead of short-term. And I think if this succeeds, the benefits that can accrue to society and to economies are higher than if these two, let's say, concepts and projects operate separately and not interact with each other. So in short, to answer your question, yes, there are points and synergies in which these two different concepts can interact and can enhance each other. But that requires work along the way. Yeah. So I would stop here.
Eugenia, no doubt that the role of finance is a key one in helping to sort of ensure that complementarity can that complementarity can exist between these two concepts at a project or at a transaction level. I want to jump straight to thinking about the role of finance in this dynamic. Rastraraj, I want to turn to you. You've had experience in developing initiatives that help channel more resources and finance into this area. Can I ask, what role do you see finance playing in accelerating and deepening that complementarity that Eugenia spoke of earlier?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Look, that's a great question as well, and I think the core of what we're going to talk about today. Even if these two concepts were inherently designed to serve different purposes and stuff, right? And I think, as the poll suggests from the audience, there is a lot of overlap and there is a lot of complementarity. Now, the question then becomes, how do you actually implement both of these things? Even with the BRI, well, SDG 9 is on infrastructure, right? And BRI, we'll talk about connectivity, but it's also about infrastructure. So part of the problem also is in terms of how do you actually achieve these complementing goals. And I think that's where sort of finance and basically a common understanding of what both of these actually mean comes very handy. So especially the work that I've done, especially when I was living in China, was on taxonomies. And how do you create a taxonomy where you clearly identify what are the projects, especially in the project level, that can define and give these impacts, right? So when you talk about sustainability, what are the projects and how can they be designed to actually provide the sustainable development benefits along the BRI? So obviously, I think, look, both of these projects, obviously, in a much more macro level, they're talked about as a top-down approach, even the SDGs by a lot of commentators, BRI more so. But there's also a very strong demand element to it, right? What are the host countries seeking for? And that's finance and that's investments. So finance is key but also alongside finance, we need a lot of other frameworks, like monitoring, reporting, transparency, things like that. And the way I see it is finance obviously is in the crux in the middle of this, and supporting that, you've got policies, you've got financial institutions, MDBs, civil society. We shouldn't forget their role in finance, because oftentimes it's looked at as a very financy thing, right? So I think it's a lot of different actors, but obviously coming from a finance background, I do think finance, and especially market-based instruments, are very important.
Sure. When I think of taxonomies and the role that they play, I see them as having a really important clarifying impact when we think about categorization, because if you don't clarify and categorize what is or isn't a project that has sustainability generating impacts, then you're potentially misdirecting your finance, right? And I think that over the past couple of years, we've seen different taxonomies spring up from different regions. We've got one in the European Union, we've got one developed by the UNDP in China. I can only hope that these taxonomies are in concert with one another, and that they speak to one another metaphorically, and that they don't create more obfuscation and confusion around the categorizations than was in existence before they came into being. Okay, taxonomies are something that I'm sure we'll come back onto in a moment. Yingzhi, can I pose the same question to you? I know that you've done a lot of work on international project finance, and I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about the role that you see that playing in bringing together SDGs or sustainable development generally and BRI.
Yes, for sure. So for me, green finance is absolutely instrumental to create a SDG aligned BRI. And for green finance, there are two aspects I want to share. For the start is greening financing, greening the existing financial activities, which means measuring and managing climate and biodiversity related financial risks, improving the disclosures of the impacts of the existing financial activities on our environment and society, making sure those will not undermine our pursuit of SDGs. And on the flip side, we of course need to finance green, accelerate capital flows into low carbon sectors and CCUS technologies through investments, through development finance, through technical assistance, and most importantly, also channel the private sector. Financial instruments such as green, social, and sustainability bonds really took off over the past year, even during the COVID, actually. So the amount issued in 2020 labeled as green, social, and sustainability bonds by CBI, Climate Bond Initiative, almost doubled the amount in the year before. So we are actually seeing the accelerated efforts on green financing. There are more green financing flowing into the more SDG aligned activities. And also I do appreciate we can jump back to the taxonomy, because I do want to add on that as well later on. Yeah. I can do that right now. Yeah, for sure. So as already mentioned by Rastraraj and also by you, there are the previous challenges for the taxonomy work is we do not have a classification system, aka taxonomy for financial activities. However, over the past few years, the dilemma is we have too many taxonomies. And Dr. Ma Jun, the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, always saying that we need harmonization. And just several days ago, I think this week, EU and China released the Common Ground Taxonomy, really groundbreaking. And what I want to see is the common understanding built upon this work in order to lower the transboundary green investment activities, green investment costs, and scale up the green capital internationally. So that's my take on both the green finance and on the taxonomy type of work. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Sarah. When I think about taxonomies working well, I really see them as really requiring like a strong collaborative nexus between state and private sector, because although the state we've seen has played a leading role in preparing, financing, operating these projects as well, I think we're now starting to see a shift where we're hoping to see more private funds being mobilized, private capital being mobilized, being crowded in. And it certainly makes sense that the taxonomies that we're talking about don't just reflect public preferences and aspirations on the public side, but also those from the private as well. I mean, yeah, and no doubt that's a broader lesson that we can draw for the BRI as a whole, where we want to see more private players getting involved as well. I mean, to what extent do you see that as being totally important, Rastra? You're nodding your head very rigorously.
Oh no, yeah, 100%, right? I think the common narrative and the discourse around BRI is public financing, and I think even with COP, for example, with I think 450 companies worth $130 trillion have committed to aligning themselves with Paris, and I think there's that's good, but then on the other hand, that's also only 40%, right? So I think there's a massive opportunity for the private sector, especially in terms of SDGs as well as BRI. And there's actually a lot of research on the business case for SDGs and sustainable financing and investment. Yeah, I was also nodding my head because I wanted to add something on this taxonomy stuff. I agree with Sarah that there's been a mushrooming of a lot of different taxonomies over the past few years, but also the reality is there, well, and I guess this is up for debate, but according to my view, there are essentially two schools of thought with taxonomies. One is the European Union, which is more aligned with the Climate Bond Initiative's taxonomy, right? And then the other one is Chinese, and the Chinese green guidelines. And sorry, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but the Chinese taxonomy, for example. So essentially, like what you see is you've got two schools of thought. So the common ground taxonomy between EU and China that was released a few days ago is really groundbreaking, because if we can get these two taxonomies together, then that also automatically means that a lot of these different taxonomies can automatically be harmonized, right? So yes, on one hand, on the outset, there are a lot of different taxonomies, but if you read through the taxonomies, they aren't inherently different. It's just that there are two schools of thoughts. Yeah, so I just wanted to flag that as well, in terms of it's not as puzzly and chaotic as it may seem.
But there are so many pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that we need to consider when it comes to finance. So it's one word, but it encompasses lots of different processes, actions, risks, opportunities. And I want to turn very briefly to the challenges, because past experience shows us that it hasn't always been easy to align Belt and Road with the SDGs to create some of the beneficial socioeconomic synergies that Eugenia began telling us about. The right balance hasn't always been struck, and I guess I want to have a little bit of a deep dive into, okay, what are the challenges? But then again, what are some of the practical recommendations that we've been working on, or that we've seen that can help mitigate those challenges? Eugenia, if I can turn to you very briefly, I was reading into some of the work done by the UN BRI SDGs project, and in particular into the case study of Romania, where I understand that there is a national sustainable development plan, and when the BRI was announced, there was a slew of memorandums of understanding, which kind of gave the impression that, okay, we can see a bit of a synergy taking place here. What would you say has been the outcome of those two parallel tracks? Have we seen progress, or where there have been challenges? What would you say those challenges have been?
Tough question, Michael. But you hit the nail on this one, because when we talk about SDGs, now we also talk about energy transition. We also had the BRI launched here in Bucharest in 2013, right? And we are in the middle of this 2 or 3 different processes, right? So sustainability, energy transition, we're trying to attract FDIs because Romania, even if, my country is a medium-sized country. So we're not a big country, not a small one, but medium-sized. We're members of the European Union, but that does not mean that if we are EU members of a rich bloc, right, the EU, we do not have development issues. We still have many sectors and issues in which we need to do a lot of work on developing and on putting in place the infrastructure that we need. And there are areas in which Romania has still a lot of work to do, right? So we are interested in development and in attracting foreign direct investment. However, I have noticed working on this and looking into this is that in the first years, so since the BRI was launched, the memorandums were signed in Romania, there was somewhat of a misalignment, right, between, let's say, the areas in which Romania was able to receive investment, right, under the BRI framework, for instance, investment in coal-fired power plants, and the general framework of the EU and the EU policy of which we're a part of and which we have to take into consideration and to work in that direction. So basically what we have seen in Romania in the first 5 years, so 2013, 2018, 19, right, is, the BRI and the EU policy, especially on energy and climate, pulling Romania in two opposite directions. And that was unfortunate because Romania was struggling. We need development, we want infrastructure, we want, power plants, new power plants. But then the EU is pushing us into the direction of, closing down maybe coal-fired power plants and into the direction of green energy, right? So this is the most prominent example that I can think of a situation in which we were interested, in both, because Romania also promoted renewable energy, and we have had some 5 gigawatts of renewable energy being added to our power generation capacity under the EU directive pushing for this. But on the other hand, we wanted also to, have some cooperation and to benefit from some foreign direct investments under the BRI framework. But here, this was this, misalignment, and quite a gross misalignment, right? That was pulling us in different directions. Nothing happened in the end, and this because the pull from the EU proved stronger, right, than the pull under the BRI framework. Because something's got to give in such a situation. And what happened is that the investment in the coal-fired power plant in Romania did not happen. Because what was predominant and what we had to comply with, and our first priority that we have to comply with is the EU energy policy and environment policy. So we cannot, go a separate way on this, right? And the EU energy policy only accelerated in the past 2, 3, 4 years in this direction, and the COP climate. So everything is going into this direction of pushing, coal phase out, accelerating this. And this is why, for instance, something that was intended or initially, something that Romania, or some actors in Romania were interested, let's say, there was political will behind, the coal-fired power plant, building new coal-fired power plants. It did not happen, right? Because it went against a much stronger force, of which we are a part of, we are an EU member. So this is the kind of misalignment that hindered some of the BRI investment in Romania in the first years. Now there are some others, let's say, that maybe worked, let's say, on a smaller scale, but the big project, strategic projects also have to take into account a country's ability, administrative capacity, and ability to carry such projects through, right? Because, for instance, if we talk about Romania, right, we have high political instability. Our government changes every year, almost. Even as we speak, we have a caretaker government that's in place for 2 months, so we do not have currently a stable government sworn in, right? And for big projects, you need that kind of stability. So there are many issues, for misalignment between the two directions that I was talking initially. Then there's this political instability of the host country, in which this project is meant to happen. Then what should I say? Maybe courage, sometimes courage, right, of the political leadership, because even if we are part of the EU, that doesn't mean that there is not local, national, specifically to Romania, resistance to, let's say, greener policies, right? And you can come across this attitude, oh, but we're not ready to green our transport. Let's wait. Well, if we wait in Romania until we are ready, we may not do anything ever, because for as long as I've known, we have not been ready, you know. But you have to start doing some things, even if you feel that you're not ready, because the technology is there. If, let's say, things move slower in your country, maybe they move faster in other places, you know, things are invented. So you have to start working in this direction of greening the economy. And I think this intersection between, let's say, the green BRI, so the green infrastructure and the Belt and Road Initiative and the UN SDGs and the EU climate and energy policy is the direction that is most likely to be successful if we're talking about building new infrastructure. Because what we have to do is unprecedented, not only for Romania. We have to re-engineer the entire energy system, how we produce, how we consume, energy. So it has to do with almost every sector: transport, buildings, industry, right? And it's a huge effort, and you cannot put that only on the citizen, because from the bottom of your heart, some citizens may be able to switch to a greener car, but others will reply to incentives, and this is the job of the government, right? So they have to put the incentives in place, like Norway, which embraced the electric vehicles, not from the bottom of their heart, but because Norway had put in place incentives that stimulated the acquisition of electric vehicles, to the detriment of the fossil fuel powered cars. So everyone has a part to play here. And even if you think that, because we're talking and our discussion takes place on the last day of the COP conference, COP26, right? Even if we feel that, and there are countries that may feel that we're not in the right point, in the right moment to start doing things or to accelerate, we cannot do that. It will hurt our economy. You have, if you do something, it's more than nothing. And the little that you can do will be a step forward, even if you think that, you're not ready at this point in time.
Thanks for that, Eugenia. I completely agree, and I certainly hope that the commitments made at COP today, that hopefully will, of which I hope, we'll see, your fruits, and the agreement will show that commitment to scale down, support for coal energy, translates at some point in the future for in Romania, translates at some point into the future into renewed investment into the Chernovoda nuclear power plant that I know is in Romania, and also other hydroelectric projects that I know were under consideration as well. But to focus on other challenges within this umbrella of finance challenges, and I completely hear what Eugenia says around the difficulty around strategic direction when you have changing governments all the time, because these tasks are complex and you need strong strategic direction from the top for the bureaucracy and civil servants to sort of complete the process of closing a transaction. I now want to think about other challenges, and I know that Sarah's research has focused on challenges, but from a slightly different perspective in terms of closing the deal, agreeing terms in project finance transactions. And I wonder, Sarah, if you could share with us some thoughts you have on that.
I think, yeah, I do share Eugenia's feelings about different strategic energy investment strategies, putting Romania into two directions. And equally important as the government strategies is the financial institutions, their plans, their strategies, and including multilateral development banks. They have to, through my research on the project financing, the commercial financial institutions, they have to strengthen their own environmental and social frameworks and make sure their financing, their investments, their guarantees, and for the insurers, their underwriting activities compatible with our 1.5 degree future. And coming back to the government public financing, there are a lot of pledges committed during the COP, but we have to put concrete steps behind the pledges, including aligning fiscal spending, aligning recovery stimulus, FDIs, foreign direct investments, with the SDGs, improve the market transparency through making environmental and social disclosure mandatory, support green bond issuance, and also can issue like sovereign green bond to demonstrate to the market. And I want to also like time back to the first very like philosophical question about how the BRI and SDG can be complementary to each other. The concrete steps behind this for the government's public financing first. On the end, and also tying back to Eugenia's feelings about energy investments, stop overseas investment in coal, which China already pledged during this year's UNGA, and orderly for China accelerate the divestment from natural gas and other fossil fuels, which are totally incompatible to our 1.5-degree future. Second, support the development of solar, wind, and other forms of clean energy through grants, concessional loans, investments, and as I mentioned earlier, to mobilize the private sector. Last but not least, and this one is sometimes like underestimated, support the reskilling and upskilling of fossil fuel workers. This can help us to achieve the leave no one behind SDG agenda. The fossil fuel workers, they are very vulnerable during the low carbon transition. More than 1.2 million jobs in the fossil fuel industries are lost or at risk. And this is an old number, probably an underestimate. And just putting another number out there, spending for green energy creates 3 times the jobs compared to the same dollar amount spent on the fossil fuels. It is important to align BRI with SDGs, and my recommendations for the financial institutions, including MDBs, and my recommendations to the governments, both the host countries and the financing governments.
I think those recommendations are being pushed for and advocated for as we speak at COP. So I certainly hope to be reading clues that resonate with what you've just said in the document, which I think, of which I think a draft was released an hour ago, but we still don't have any final wording. So, I'm keeping an eagle eye out for that, if and when or if it comes in during the course of our call today. Rastra, any thoughts from you on challenges that you've seen in your experience or in your research and the corresponding measure?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question. I think I've always focused on the demand side, right? Like what's happening in developing countries, what's happening in host countries, and there's a multitude of challenges, primarily stemming from the simple fact that financial markets are not mature, right? So you're talking about countries that don't have credit ratings, for example. You're talking about countries where ease of doing business is very low. You're talking about countries that have never issued a green bond before, right? And this is the majority of countries you're talking about when you're talking about Africa or even in Asia. Yeah, the ASEAN is a great model for how you can overcome these barriers and, like release green bonds, release this sustainable financial instruments and stuff. So I think there are a lot of examples these countries can look into in terms of how do you sort of get out of that circular sort of puzzle and eventually move towards, and what are the low-hanging fruits you can eventually take and sort of start moving in that direction, right? Because obviously recommendations are important, but they also need to be aligned and they need to be put in a structure so a policymaker knows where to start and where to end, rather than just 10 bullet points, which I think, is something that I've seen very often in policy recommendations. It just club them together, but you need a structure and a framework on how you look at recommendations as well. Something else that I wanted to briefly talk about, two other things in terms of challenges. One, based on my experience working in developing countries and advising developing countries, is there's a very strong presence of collateral-based lending as opposed to project financing, right? Which is a big barrier So yes, we can talk about project financing, but the reality is for a lot of countries, this is not a reality. Everything's collateral-based lending, and for me, especially talking about sustainability, what that ends up doing is a lot of people who can put that collateral tend to be men, right? So you don't see a lot of women who are creating these projects. So the project development side is very interesting as well. And this leads to one of the big problems. And this actually goes back, I remember I was at a conference in Sydney, Credit Suisse in 2015. And one of the biggest barriers they talked about was a lack of pipeline in developing countries. Right, and this was 2015, right after the Paris Agreement was adopted. Everyone was excited about green bonds, and the big conversation there was, well, there's no pipeline. What are we going to do about it? And if you go through a lot of host countries and countries part of BRI, however you define that, you look at their pipelines, and they've got coal in their pipelines, right? They've got infrastructure projects that aren't aligned with SDGs in their pipeline as well. So essentially building that pipeline and linking that with nationally determined contributions, right? So you need to translate NDCs into investment plans and the pipeline, because the problem is oftentimes these documents are looked at as standalone documents, but they need to be turned into investment plans. So I think essentially that's sort of the story of the demand side. And obviously supply side is very important. I think especially a couple of instruments that need to be pushed a bit more with respect to BRI are the debt for climate swaps. Also, I'd like to mention the debt for nature swaps. We need to look into biodiversity as well, because climate is different than biodiversity. Yes, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation and still have an impact on biodiversity, right? And this is a conversation we're not having yet. So I think that's one instrument that I like to focus a bit more on, because obviously, BRI talk a lot about debt. I think the debt trap conversation is still very dominant in a lot of conversations.
Well,
yeah, so I think those two. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No. I was just going to thank you, because I think the debt narrative around BRI is really strong, but the one thing around debt that I think is sometimes lost from the coverage is that debt, when unsustainable, when not bankable, is a problem, but when it's well managed, it's not so much of a problem. Every time a loan is made, that is a debt liability that someone takes on. So it's not as pernicious, and it's not as geostrategically worrying as I think some of the coverage that I've seen would suggest. And in any case, even when transactions do go into problems, debt can be restructured, and that's where I think some of the two instruments you mentioned, the debt for nature, the debt for climate swaps, come into play. Rastra, for those who aren't familiar with those structures, could you explain in just a couple of sentences what they essentially involve?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm not an expert on these three instruments in particular, but my understanding, especially this entire conversation, came about through the debt for resource swaps. And I think I've read some literature on debt for resource swaps with Angola, for example, where, well, if Angola can't pay the debt, then they're going to pay back with oil. And sort of like you pay back your debt through a resource. Whereas with climate, you can pay back with climate mitigation, and especially for debt for nature, then that relates more to biodiversity. So you're in debt, but then the way you pay back the debt could be in terms of biodiversity conservation or nature management and things like that. But yeah, others may want to push through on that. And funnily enough, I actually don't know many projects where debt for nature in particular has been utilized. And yeah, that's also something that I want to research a bit more on in the coming years. Yeah.
From my understanding, let's bring in Sarah. Hey, Sarah.
Yeah, sure. So for the debt for nature swaps, so our research center has previously been conducting like literature reviews over this, and we certainly want to see like this alignment on like reducing, like increasing the biodiversity like commitments while reducing the debt stress among the BRI countries, especially like during the COVID. So just one word on the debt for nature swap. The idea, the concept is not foreign to us. It originates from the debt for resource swap, and the structure can be like simply explained as Rastraraj just did to all of us, but it requires a lot of negotiations, a lot of years, and there have been like previous like successful stories between the US and Seychelles, I think, a very small island country, over a very small deal of money managed by TNC. So there have been successful presidents in the past. Before this COP, we also see the COP15 on the biodiversity in Kunming, and China has pledged to contribute to this Kunming Fund for biodiversity commitments. So what I'm just sharing things like on top of my mind, like can we mobilize these funds for the Debt for Nature swap? That is probably an idea that's worth like exploring in the future. And again, like I'm only like representing myself, not Chinese government or any like not my employer. This is a very like hot and sensitive topic out there. Yeah.
You know, I think now is a moment for bold thinking, and I wouldn't be surprised if conversations or similar questions are being asked elsewhere outside of this call. I have a question from Anna that I want to jump straight to, and it's around evaluating media coverage of China's progress in addressing the SDGs. You know, China obviously has an interest in maximizing its SDG credentials, and maybe there is a sense that that is not universal, that is not well recognized outside of China in other countries. And I wonder if anybody from the panel would like to comment on the sort of public opinion, the public perception surrounding the topic we've discussed today. Excellent question, Anna. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Anna, for the question. But I don't think I'm the best person to answer that, because I'm coming from like both from the green and the finance background, and I don't have like expertise too much on the international relations. But my understanding of the barriers of the lack of media coverage, also like put it simply, the lack of credit over to China on greening the BRI, is the language barrier. Like there are some documents that is unique, that is different, and that is first of its kind. For example, the guidelines on greening China's overseas investment and overseas activities, which ask Chinese financiers and investors and Chinese companies to consider like going beyond the host country regulations to adapt to the international common practices, such as the World Bank practices. So this should be appreciated, but it often, like, because like Chinese policy documents, even as a Chinese like native speaker, sometimes I do not even understand like what they mean, like over those like paragraphs of very confusing languages there. So I think the language barrier is one of the key, like, for the lack of media coverage for
Thanks,
this.
Sarah.
Yeah.
I want to turn to Eugenia, because I think Eugenia probably has some really interesting experiences and insights on this. You know, Eugenia, you worked as part of a multinational team, taking deep dives into different countries along the Belt and Road as part of your consultancy. You know, you've also spoken a little bit about the experiences and the situation in Romania, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the buy-in or lack thereof that you see in the countries that you've worked on.
Sure. So, first of all, this, you know, the green turnaround, or like the green angle, like the idea of greening the BRI came later. So this was not part of the initial package, right? So when the BRI was launched in 2013, you know, renewable energy was there, right? But it was not the main focus, like green investments in hard infrastructure. So I think that at the level of public opinion worldwide, this is what stuck, right, in terms of message. Even if, you know, later, so in the past year and a half, 2 years, there has been this, you know, initiative and attempt to green the BRI investments, but many people, remained with the initial rhetoric and how it was initially framed, right? So here I think what will convince the public are the actual examples of green investments. So, because this move away from coal projects cannot happen overnight, right? But what will maybe sway the public opinion is to see more green projects being built and given as a counterexample, because once you start a project, a big, large-scale project, it's difficult to turn things around or just on the go, right? So I think this will take time, but in the media coverage, it is present. So people know, and the public reads in the newspapers the fact that the BRI, wants to push for greener investments, and will move away from coal. So this is already present, but probably what will convince the public are the actual examples that will come out of it. Now, you asked me about the experience that I had as part of an international team. The situation, the project covered 16 countries, and the situation in all these 16 countries was different, right? Some countries have a stronger jurisdiction with respect to environmental protection. Other countries have weaker jurisdictions with respect to environmental protection. All this matters, in the way negotiations are conducted, these investments are unfolding. So this is a case-by-case experience, I would say. But let me refer to the example that I know best, again, Romania. And when you also asked about difficulties or challenges and public opinion and how it reacted in Romania to these things. Initially, the reaction was positive. BRI investments are coming, Then a few years pass and we see that things are not moving so fast. Things don't happen. Well, there are difficulties, challenges. And then, part of the public opinion moved into this, how should I say, said this, like, why we should not, how we prioritize investments. Sure, this is a possibility for us to develop, but we have also, in the case of Romania, what I'm trying to say is that Romania, being a member of the EU, it also has access to EU funds, right? So the way the discussion unfolded here in Romania was in the sense that for Romania, the priority should be using the EU funds available first, and then, the rest of the foreign direct investments that may come from other sources, right? So in our case, and at the level of the public decision, public discourse, public debate in Romania, this is what happened. And there was a initial, very warm welcome to the BRI investments in Romania. And then this moved into the opposite direction in the sense that we should prioritize EU funds, right? Why? Because they are more in line with the EU legislation, and also different requirements sometimes that come as a part of the package, like more transparency, like public tenders, and another way of approaching these projects, under the BRI framework. Sometimes, bilateral approach can work in some countries, maybe where there's less scrutiny, but in countries where there's such a high degree of scrutiny from the part, let's say, of the donor, the EU, right? These things need to be approached differently and with much more due diligence, with much more transparency, especially in a country which deals and suffers and struggles with corruption, because my country, I'm fully aware, and there's a whole generation of us that we are aware that we have not, done away with corruption. It's still present, even if we have put up a fight, but it's still ongoing, it still happens. So that's why the preference of the public opinion for funds that have more scrutiny and transparency embedded in the project and the way they are structured and then they are built. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think your final point leads me really nicely onto another question that I see from the chat around around due diligence, but in this particular question in relation to greenwashing and how we can ensure that we do technical assessments robustly, honestly, accurately, to reflect to give a true reflection of the environmental or social risks and impacts that might be at play for a given project. And I wonder if I could just restate the question. So how do we prevent SDG greenwashing in BRI impacts, in reporting on BRI? Huge question that probably relies on technical capacity, to have a really strong talent base in your institutions that can screen projects well, prepare projects well. But Rastraraj, I think you're about to unmute yourself before I interrupted you. Sorry.
No, that's right. I mean, I can take that, because obviously one of the big things about me tracking COP26 is also trying to understand what's greenwashing and what's not. Because as you know, the Green Climate Fund, the 100 billion commitment came back as far as Copenhagen, and that was a pledge, and it's not been achieved yet, right? So obviously, I think on a much more macro level, there's this global debate on what do pledges actually mean, and I think part of your answer is gonna come in the coming years. I think it's a bit too soon to understand what's actually going on. And I think over time, we've already seen some countries with their long-term strategies that have put forward very clear direction and positive signaling in terms of where they're going. So I think in the macro level, that is, I do think we're headed in the right direction, although you're going to get bits and pieces of greenwashing. And I think it's up to us to understand as well and to do our own internal due diligence, especially when we're reading media. But I think on a much more technical level, Michael, and I think that's what you're alluding to. Look, it's an important question. Washington Post did, I don't know if you read it, but they did a massive study of all of the NIRs and BURs, which is the inventories of all the countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement. And they state how a lot of countries are underreporting their emissions, especially with relation to sequestration from forestry and how you're cutting that off from your emissions inventory, right? And a lot of countries haven't submitted their BURs since 2010, 12, not even after the adoption of the Paris Agreement. So obviously the technical capacity in terms of reporting, and this is just for emissions, it's a massive problem. Now you talk about SDGs, it's not just emissions, it's about social impacts, it's about environmental impacts, right? And that's just another level of conversation that really needs to happen more in terms of how do you quantify the impacts? And I just put a case study from the Asian Development Bank that's done this very well. And they're developing a new methodology as well in terms of how do you actually measure and quantify. And you also have a lot of different standards, right? Like that can verify this for you, like independent standards. So if you see those and they're part of the gold standard or things like that, then gold standard is the robust standard for SDG verification, for example. So I think as consumers and as recipients of knowledge, I think it's also in our responsibility to understand what's greenwashing and not. So I'll end it there, Michael. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rastraraj. If I reflect on the conversation we've had over the past hour, 3 key items on a to-do list emerged to me. Number 1 is around utilizing frameworks such as taxonomies to have really clear categorizations for where we're going to be directing our finance moving forward into the future. Number 2, innovative financial structures that place more of an emphasis on the environment, on nature, such as the swaps we discussed. And number 3, finally ending with what you've just said, Rastraraj, in terms of due diligence and good project preparation, so that you have a good pipeline that you can have confidence in as a financier. I have an eye on the time. We have 4 minutes left before time is up. And I guess I want to end with a question that looks towards the future, because I know that for many in the audience today, we have professionals that either work in this space or scholars or students researching it or wanting to break into the space. And we all agree that the relevance, importance, and urgency of this topic won't diminish during the 2020s. It will only grow. So as I've been taught to end any panel with a direct answer to the question, can I ask each of you to give me 1 adjective that you would use to describe the state of play, and 1 adjective that you would use to describe the future of the alignment between SDGs and Belt and Road, as a way of summarizing your thoughts and feelings on the dialogue so far. And perhaps I could turn back to Sarah to go first.
I feel optimistic of the current state of play, and I feel confident in the directions we are going, especially observing the past few days on the COP 26, the plans, the commitments, the pledges. I feel like we have this multilateral responses towards resolving this common, the common, I would say, like challenges, both climate and biodiversity.
As I turn to Rastra, I'm going to relaunch the poll just to get a second look at some of the questions that we asked at the beginning. Rastra, over to you.
I actually had to go and Google and see if the word I chose is an adjective or not. The word I think that aptly reflects what's happening now and what's happened before is unharmonized. And I think what we're going to see moving forward is the opposite, harmonized. And I'd just like to very quickly, sorry, Michael, I'll just take 20 seconds, say that this is the first time in history that we have an opportunity to actually be in the same board when it comes to our understanding of what climate action means, right? Kyoto, that wasn't the case at all. We had a rift with developing countries and developed, right? Even with the Paris, it was bottom up, we had NDCs, but each country had its own pledges and everything was very, very, you know, like some were very robust and some were not. But what we're seeing now with the 2050 net zero targets is we have the same goal, we have the same aspiration. And I think that really changes the game when it comes to harmonization, because a developing country cannot now demand for coal, right? So now developed countries and financiers do not have that excuse of saying, well, the developing countries have different needs than we do. So I do think inherently, because if we can align what net zero means, and if countries can stick to the IEA guidelines, for example, then we're going to see a very natural alignment and harmonization. Finance, policies, carbon taxes, carbon prices, addressing carbon leakages. So I really think if we can hone that down, then harmonization is where we're headed towards. Thanks.
Thank you, Rastra. From disharmony to harmony. I'm going to give the final word to Eugenia. What are your two adjectives?
Well, expressions more than adjectives. I would say current state of play is about summoning the will, not only of the government, but also of the private sector, like calling up on everyone, you know, to do its part, because and the adjective, well, the expression for the outlook, right? I would say uphill battle for sustainability, because what needs to be done will not be easy, but again, it's not supposed to be easy. It will be difficult, right? Because, you know, after all is said and done, and the conferences are important, you know, this diplomatic, this climate diplomacy, it's very important. But after all this, you know, people go home and, you know, some things needs to be taken and decisions and, you know, measures implemented. And this is what the hardest part is, like how to deliver on these pledges, which are non-binding, right, at home, how to actually make things happen. And that will be an uphill battle everywhere, right?
Uphill battles is the message that I'm hearing from Eugenia, but I hear determination in her voice as well, which I'm sure I will characterize efforts moving forward from COP, I hope. Eugenia.
One final thought. I think, you know, our panel today, but also the participants that have attended and listened to our discussion, you know, we all have, my final thought is that we all have a part to play in this, because all of us, no matter in what field we are working, right? You can be an advisor, you can be in government, you can work in the private sector in the company, you can be a loan officer, bank officer, you're approving loans, right? In one way or another, we are on the front lines of this battle for sustainability, right? In everything we do, in the choices we take, by, you know, how to get to point A to point B, you know, by train, or should I take a greener car, or, you know, what house do I buy, or what project do I prioritize for funding, like for someone working in a bank, right? So everyone, in some way or another, contributes to us moving forward on this agenda.
Absolutely. This conversation does not take place in a vacuum. If anything, we're in the vacuum, with the problems that we've discussed, and it's down to us to try and navigate our way through them. I really like that call to action, Eugenia. Thanks very, very much, and thanks also to the panel as a whole. I mean, we've had some really cutting edge analysis, but we've also heard about some really practical key recommendations that I for one will be keeping an eye out for. I hope it was fun, but I also hope it was instructive too. And yeah, that's it from this panel today. Thanks very much to the speakers, Eugenia, Sarah, and Rastra. Thank you.